Architecture is an art and an industry. We are born in architecture and we die in architecture. We dwell in architecture and go to school in architecture. We love and dream and work surrounded by architecture. Even our livelihood is hinged to architecture. It is directly ahead. The largest of American industries will be building and construction. Architecture.
This year is a critical one in the aesthetic side of modern architecture. It's really three great men, and they're sort of like the pillars that are holding up this architecture. They are Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, who we call Corbu, and Mies van der Rohe, who we call Mies. But have they written the last chapter? I think we must look along the moving line of history, way back from the time of the Greeks, who created a beautiful, marvelous architecture, almost like a mountaintop. Then there was another mountaintop, the Roman architecture, and then, of course, the Gothic cathedral and the Renaissance. And then we think we're on our way in modern architecture to creating another great period of architecture. Let's just focus on our own line. Just where are we on this line? I feel very strongly that we are on this level. Now this has to be integrated, the vocabulary has to be expanded before modern architecture take its place among the great styles of architecture. We've spent the last 80 years in building the basic vocabulary. Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies, and Corbu have given us the ABC. It is up to us to develop a complete language of modern architecture. We have a long and terribly challenging and marvelous job ahead of us.
These are the ambidextrous hands of Eero Saarinen, an artist, one of the 22,000 registered architects practicing in this country. The artistic challenge he worries about may seem remote, but in the hands of Miles Colleen, the construction economist, this challenge in architecture assumes a dimension that touches every one of us.
This is the number of today's dollars that we shall spend in construction during the next 10 years. $500 billion. This is roughly equivalent to the value of all the buildings standing in the United States today. Moreover, it's the minimum amount of construction that will provide for a growing population in an expanding economy. Actually, the figure does no more than carry forward relationships that have already been experienced. This curve represents the total value of the goods and services we produce, our gross national product. Construction has remained close to 11% of GNP, as we call it, ever since the end of World War II. There are good reasons to believe that this relationship will continue. So we shall be witnessing a unique historic event, a country almost doubling its building investment in about 10 years' time, an investment of about $500 billion.
What kind of beauty are we going to buy with all that money? We're still impressed with the buildings that came to us out of the past. The Greek temple, the Gothic cathedral. Why change? The answer comes from Frank Lloyd Wright, from Mies and their fellow artists. The aesthetics of architecture depends on the stuff with which we work, the new materials that come to us from modern technology. Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin home in the deserts of Arizona represents a wide departure from the old principles of construction he tells us about.
When you see the old post and beam construction, you can say this is the post and beam, post and beam. There's all a kind of superimposition. And if you wanted partitions, they cut and they would butt, you see, cut, butt, and slash. And if you wanted tension, you had to rivet something to something and make a connection that might give way. Well, organic architecture brought the principles together so that a building was more like this. You see, you could pull on the structure. It had tensile strength owing to steel. And owing to steel, it could have great spaces. And the great spaces could be protected with glass. The Orientals, of course, the Greeks, never had any such facility. If they'd had steel and glass, why, we wouldn't have to do any thinking today. We'd be copying them. But now...
A building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright differs sharply from one designed by Mies van der Rohe, but each in his way depends on the new materials.
Where would we be without steel and new materials? In fact, most of the people couldn't exist. They are the facts of our civilization. I think there will be not an architecture if it is not based on science and technology. I think that is just the essence of our time, and architecture is the expression of this essence.
An architectural pillar in his own right, Eero Saarinen reduces theory to actual practice.
At this time. For instance, we have the problem of the wall on a building. This is a sample of that wall. It's 3/8 of an inch thick, and with a neoprene extrusion which binds it to the structural frame of the wall. Curtain wall construction is really approaching the thickness of a curtain. Well, now let's go to another kind of architectural problem we're working on. A roof and a new way of using old materials. This is the Yale hockey rink. We're spanning the space by one single concrete arch, then hanging cables from that arch, and on that we build the roof.
Buckminster Fuller, a pioneer in new forms of construction, created this aluminum dome in Hawaii. For Mr. Fuller, technology develops radical new ways of thinking about a house, beyond its size and shape.
Weight of building has never entered into the design problem. On the sea, however, came a new concept of structure. This was the birth of performance per pound and performance per unit of energy investment. This accounts for man's familiarity with the tonnage of ships and his utter ignorance of the weights of his buildings. The USS Leyte weighs 40,000 tons. What does the Empire State Building weigh? What does your own home weigh? Out of the ship of the sea comes the ship of the air, the mechanical power-borne airship. The airship brought about performance per pound tenfold that of the ship of the sea. This efficiency accounts for the whole sudden advance in technology in the first half of the 20th century. This advance has brought about adequate standard of living from only 1% of humanity to 1/3 of humanity. Now, out of this structural competence initiated in ships of the sea, and out of the mechanical competence initiated in the power-borne airship,
comes the birth of our ability to convert our resources to serve not 30% of the population, but the whole of humanity. This is a geodesic dome designed for the United States Marine Corps. They're now in mass production and can be produced for $1,800. They contain 1,400 square feet of floor space, which is about the floor area of what is considered a large 5-room house. If we were to produce a dome of equivalent size by the conventional building arts, it would weigh 100 times the weight of this dome. This linking of structures on land, sea, and air may seem a far cry from the day-to-day architecture with which we are familiar. But in the technology and industrial resources incorporated in that structure now being flown away to service on the land lies the potential means for architects to make enjoyment of the earth by all its inhabitants a reality.
This unlimited, wonderful world of technology where to be done is marvelous and it's fascinating. Around the corner one can well see whole shopping centers, whole stadiums and centers of cities even being covered by translucent domes heated by atomic energy and so on. But all this makes one wonder and makes one hesitate. And with all these freedoms that technology is giving us to do almost anything we want, it also places more responsibility on the shoulders of the architect ever before.
It is not only a responsibility just in relation to technology, but to beauty as well. There's a fear on the part of architect Edward Stone, who designed this museum, that our concern with economics and technology obscures the traditional purpose of architecture.
Nowadays, an architect is a bit embarrassed to think of himself as an artist. He now begins to look more and more like a businessman or a lawyer or a banker. He talks about the budget, how he'll meet the budget, how he'll return dollar for dollar on the investment. In fact, all the unattractive facts of our profession. While his clients are sympathetic with great art, painting and sculpture, they too are a little ashamed to confess that they're creating, that their objective is a work of art. It seems to me that the architect should, again, think of himself as an artist and confess to himself and to his clients and to the world that his object is to do a beautiful building, in fact, a work of art.
Yet these buildings on the lakefront in Chicago developed from a completely different kind of logic, the most efficient use of the materials available in our time. They are the architectural answer by Mies van der Rohe to the question he is asked in his class at Illinois Tech. Mies, isn't your purely technical approach to architecture a denial of aesthetics, of beauty?
No, I don't think so at all. I think the technological approach is just to use the means we have in our time. And the aesthetic is a question of proportions, of detail. As somebody said, God is in the details.
Mies, should we not design for the human dimension, the human scale?
I have to ask you, what is a human scale and what is a human dimension? Who is you? You or I? I like that and you like something else.
Freedom of choice is an American principle. Do you think that people will accept the regimentations of space imposed by your architectural planning? In other words, do you think that people will buy it?
First of all, I deny that there is any regulation on our part in planning. We try to plan our buildings or houses as flexible as possible. Our structures live much longer than the functions we designed for or could design it for. So the only solution I can see is the greatest flexibility. I would replace this phrase of Sullivan, that form follows function. I said, let us make room enough for any function. And the question that you say about if somebody would buy it, some will and some won't. But I think that Mr. Greenwald, he could tell you more about this question because that is his business.
Herbert Greenwald is the Chicago builder who financed this building, as well as most of Mises' buildings in this country.
We must understand what we mean by, will they buy it? We will find that when we give people space and let them indulge themselves as they will, no two spaces will ever be alike. Here in this building, for example, we have the stern modernist and the bare modernist. And then we have the woman who loves antiques. And here we'll find Baroque and Barococo. And we'll find modern and modernesque and modernoid. We'll find every shade and hue of color. We don't believe in regimentation. We believe in order. And order and discipline are totally different from regimentation. And this ties in with Mises' idea of logic. You ask, does it pay? How can it not pay? If it has validity, it must pay. But to speak practically without theory, what 10 years ago was a novelty, what was so hard to finance, the first Mises building on the south side of Chicago, brought with it today a return of at least 100% on an investment of that day. We're pushing the frontiers of technology, and the insurance companies and the lending institutions recognize it. Yes, it pays.
Mr. Greenwald brings us back to economics. The lending institutions he talks about, their money is really our money. It is we ourselves who will finance this new era of construction through the money we save or through the taxes we pay. Each one of us, therefore, has a personal interest in seeing that good architecture is good economics. Now we're going to look at types of individual buildings, and it might be helpful to break down the total original sum that I gave you into the investment we shall be making in some of these. Probably more than a third of our construction money will be spent in residential building. Close to $200 billion in the next 10 years. In the same period, over $41 billion will be spent in schools and $8.5 billion on religious buildings. During these 10 years, we shall spend on commercial and industrial buildings $85 billion, of which $45 billion alone will be spent on factories. Aesthetics are obviously important, but in view of these vast outlays, a beautiful building also ought to make economic sense.
And to hear Frank Lloyd Wright, these two values can be combined even in an industrial building.
I don't see why it isn't a more profitable thing to make the lives of the workers happy. They'll be more productive. As we found when we built the Johnson building, if you make them proud of their environment and happy to be where they are and give them some dignity and pride in their environment, it all comes out to the good where the product is concerned. The Johnson people have found that out. And when they got into that building, why, one of the first consequences was tea in the afternoon. And they didn't like to go home. They loved to stay in the building, be there, come early, enjoy it as charming features of a very interesting, exciting environment. And it is profitable, it does. I think the phrase is payoff, isn't it, in our country? And the payoff, of course, is the criterion by which everything is decided.
There's a limit, Mr. Wright's tone suggests, to deciding by way of the payoff. Who's to decide that limit? The architect or the man who puts up the money for the building? The question is a basic one for architect Edward Stone, who designed this United States Pavilion to represent all of us at the Brussels World's Fair.
In our discussions of architecture, there is one all-important individual whom we mustn't overlook, and that is the client himself. The architect, on one hand, must not let the client indulge in irresponsible whimsies, which would result in, as often does, a chaotic landscape. But on the other hand, he shouldn't impose too rigid a discipline and saddle this man with a straitjacket for the remainder of his days. Perhaps as important a job as any for the future of architecture is the enlightenment that we can inspire in our clients and in the general public.
To inspire and to enlighten happens to be the function of our schools. Might not the school building itself provide us with a start in our architectural education? Architect William Caudill regards the students at his school in Tyler, Texas, as important a client as any executive who signs a contract.
So what I'd like to find out from you is, what do you think of the building? What do you like about it?
Mr. Caudill, compared to the school that I used to go to, I think the way things can be moved around here at Moore, such as the desks can be moved around any way you want them, and the lunch is brought in on a cart, and everything can be moved around.
In Caudill's school, an all-glass building functions as both an auditorium and a gymnasium. The building was conceived as a playground, with all the freedom and light of the outdoors, shutting out only the weather. This junior high school has separate buildings for the different classes, a pattern that allows each different age to be treated as a small group by itself. Every architectural device is used to allow for the smallest possible unit to study and to play and to grow together. Caudill believes that the real problem of the future is to find new ways to take the sting out of mass education. School architecture is not only important to architecture itself. Children brought up in a good architectural environment will continue to appreciate good architecture throughout their entire lives. The significance of this lifelong appreciation of beauty is the text of a sermon by Frank Lloyd Wright.
I hadn't anticipated that a man who built a meeting house should be able to stand in it and preach in it. Beauty is the highest and the finest morality imaginable. Now, I believe a home is much more a home for being a work of art. And I think until it is a work of art, it lacks the essential characteristics of a home. I think that the teenage trouble, the teenager today, and all this clumpety clump down the back stairs of our social status is largely due to the lack of beauty and environment, the lack of the sense of it in the home, the lack of it in the church. And of course, the church is losing its hold on the home. It's losing its hold on democracy. You couldn't have any of this new life until you had learned to distinguish and draw the line between what is beautiful and what is curious. Now, science can't do that. The intellect can't do that. There is something in the soul of man essential to that discrimination. And that discrimination is what we must cultivate by way of church, by way of our daily life, by way of the family. But one thing we did build into the church, and one thing you see here, that is a sense of reverence. So here you'll see an expression that's best shown to you perhaps by the hands folded this way, an expression and a feeling of prayer. If you look at this building from the outside, you'll see that.
Creating a work of art, creating space for beauty and for profit, space even for a tree, is the object of architect Nathaniel Owings of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill.
A man can't live where a tree won't grow. This is a fundamental truth which I feel is a good thing to remind us ourselves of in this science-crazy day where everybody's gone head over heels about technology. The architect spends a good bit of his time studying the environment of his building in terms of the sun and the air and the trees and the grass. In Chicago, by opening up the space and giving the chance for everybody to have a focal point for their activities, we're able to raise the economic value of those areas to the point where they're justifiable from the standpoint of investment. And in that way, we can increase the rentable value of that space from 20 to 50%. In New York, for example, we've developed in Lower Manhattan a project for the Chase Manhattan Bank. Down in that area, where the only open space happens to be the graveyard of the Trinity Church, we have developed a project which clears out 2 whole city blocks. In place of this great mass of masonry will be a single shaft which covers only 1/3 of the total 2.5 acres involved. The rest will become a great central plaza in which it will be possible for the sun to penetrate and where trees and grass can grow.
Space not only increases the value of a building, it can save an entire neighborhood. That's the report we get from Robert Moses, a man who has spent 25 years coordinating public construction for the city of New York.
Had the Chase Bank, instead of deciding to rebuild there in a much bigger area and to create a sort of second Rockefeller Center, had decided to move to Midtown Manhattan, doubtless many of the other similar institutions would have followed, and that would have been a very serious blow to Lower Manhattan.
As one of the architects of Rockefeller Center, Wallace Harrison continues to pioneer the big city center with buildings on Mellon Square in Pittsburgh and the United Nations Center in New York.
What we need in America are more centers like this center in New York. Centers where people can live and enjoy life as they are able to work together here under pleasant conditions with attractive surroundings. Every center must start with an idea. In the United Nations, we had the idea of building a center for possible world peace. Years ago, when Rockefeller Center was built, the idea was to build a center for better business efficiency. Today, we must build centers for the needs of the children, the needs of the older people, of whom we are to have so many in the future. Generally, such centers will need a common open space with the peace and security that we used to have in the old village greens of New England.
These old-fashioned architectural values were brought to the service of modern industry by Eero Saarinen in his design for the 80-acre General Motors Technical Center.
We really had here an opportunity to create a total environment. It was of all the buildings, all the landscaping, everything together. Here was the technical center for a great metal producing corporation that mass produces precision metal. Somehow the character of that should get into the architecture. Therefore, the very strict lines, the sharpness, the precision, and all that. Beyond that, create a human sort of campus-like environment, which was sort of the best possible place for all this research and development to go on. These very stairways, like this one, is really a piece of sculpture in itself. We have to remember that architecture is not just here to give space and shelter for man, but architecture also has the purpose of marking and enhancing man's time on earth.
Architects design new centers for industry, but can the industrial process, the new flow of techniques and services, help the architect in designing new homes for man? The question is raised by architect Vernon DeMars out of a long experience with mass housing.
I think the American supermarket illustrates the American genius for mass production as well as anything else. Canned goods lined up on the shelves, all quite uniform. This is the way we produce housing, too. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Jones, ex-GI, buying a little house right here on the shelf with all the rest of the canned goods. I think we're victims of the production capacity that we have developed, this tendency toward homogeneity, which appraisers and bankers think is so valuable to ensure the value of a property is greatly overrated. And I think that we've got to find some way of building communities, not merely collections of houses. Here at Easter Hill, we attempted to introduce a certain kind of chaos from the very beginning, so that almost anything that people would do from then on couldn't hurt it any further. John Hardis and I were pretty worried about those 2,500 boulders that we found here on the site, but they really gave us less trouble than we had expected. They were used functionally here, a cheap way to get retaining walls and such things. Many of the principles that we experimented with here could be applied in tract development. If you have some variety in sizes of buildings, in the types of ownership, rental facilities, there will be a constant rejuvenation of this kind of a community, and it will have within itself the possibility of its own regeneration and continuance.
The city is where most architecture happens. A city grows or it dies. Architecturally, the city is an event that continues to happen. If ever that event comes to an end, the city will disappear. The future of our American cities is one of the great challenges and opportunities of our generation. The relationship of the city to its suburbs, of its present inhabitants to its new population, of its people to its machines. These are some of the relationships, always changing, that must be kept fluid and creative if the city is to be the mark of our urban civilization. Is there an architectural solution to some of these conflicts? Victor Gruen believes there is in his plan for the city of Fort Worth.
You know, I'm getting a little bit dizzy here, looking down from Fort Worth's newest and highest building. I'm watching that woman over there in that yellow car. She's driving around the department store already for the third time trying to find a parking lot. And look at her crossing the street. She's going to be killed. No, she got away with it. We must discontinue this unusable pattern of mixing automobiles and people, this melee of machines and flesh. How are we going to do it? Looking around us in all directions, we see the metropolitan area. You know, this highway network could be compared with a river system in nature. If we want to find the solution, we have to create something similar to the ocean of nature. And that is one part of the Fort Worth plan. Right around this downtown area, we are going to have a belt highway fitting snugly around the compact business area.
Inside of that highway will be the parallel to the ocean, a large collecting basin for automobiles. There will be 6 garages with a capacity of together 60,000 cars. Inside that belt highway will be an area reserved for pedestrians only, the new downtown pedestrian area of Fort Worth. Within the garages, moving sidewalks and escalators will bring the Fort Worthian citizens down to the nearest entrance towards the city. From there, they will walk 2.5 minutes to the very middle of the town. And they will walk in an environment very different from the one which we see today, with landscaped malls and courts, fountains, and sculpture. Some areas covered over completely, maybe air-conditioned malls, like in Southdale in Minneapolis. Am I talking about a dream? It may sound like one, but in the case of Fort Worth, it will become reality, because the citizens of Fort Worth want it. One of them is Mr. G.B. Thomas, president of the Texas Electric Company and one of the members of the Greater Fort Worth Planning Committee.
Thank you, Victor. It may be, as Mr. Gruen says, that there is much of a dream in this plan for Fort Worth. We who sit in chairs of responsibility in Fort Worth want to add all that we can to be sure that the Gruen plan is soundly carried through and gives us indeed a greater Fort Worth tomorrow.
In Philadelphia, the concern of another businessman for his city has brought him into the municipal government itself. For some time, Albert M. Greenfield was chairman of the City Planning Commission, for which Edmund Bacon is the executive director.
Mr. Bacon is my collaborator in this activity we now call herbiculture. It is a new word because planning is a comparatively new science, new art, and therefore you may not find that word in a dictionary, but it's a good word, herbiculture. It's keynoted in the Greenway principle, which has been developed under Mr. Bacon's direction.
This model at Panorama shows on one side the way the city now is, and as the panels revolve, the way it's going to be after the plans are carried out. Actually, what we are doing is to plan the city for the days when our children are the men and women of Philadelphia. The Greenway principle is the idea of an organized system of public open spaces designed as a series of walkways for movement into the heart of the community. The way obviously must be found to relate the new work of different architects for different clients with each other and with the historic survivals in this area in the form of old institutions and landmarks.
The morph is now probably 75% complete, and we hope will be entirely completed in the next few years. Independence Hall is the finest shrine that America has, in fact, the supreme shrine of the Western world. Must be saved, must be renovated and restored for its proper use and purpose.
In order to achieve this purpose, the architects must attune themselves to the responsibility of designing a part of a larger area. As this principle becomes more widely practiced, then the profession of architecture will begin to assume its proper role in the rebuilding of American cities. And we will leave to our children and our children's children a heritage worthy of our generation.
As members of that generation, we are more than economists, architects, builders, clients. We are members of a community responsible to one another and to the future. In this film, we have taken a look at architecture, at its roots and aesthetics, and technology, at its buildings and their environment, and finally at the city. We have looked into the future to forecast the great volume of building that will go up in this country during the next 10 years. But doesn't our discussion point to something beyond aesthetics and beyond technology, beyond economics?
One answer came from Henry R. Luce, editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, when he spoke at the centennial celebration of the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C. Looking to the future, Mr. Luce said,
"My argument and prophecy is this. For 200 years, the American people have been faithful to one dominant purpose, namely to the establishment of a form of government. That purpose has now been fulfilled, and we are at present seized by a broader challenge, namely the shaping of a civilization. We will meet that broader challenge. We will succeed in creating the first modern, technological, humane, prosperous, and reverent civilization. This creative response to challenge will be most vividly expressed in and by architecture.